So excited for our next speaker, and really kind of a new part of this topic related to slavery and freedom. There are a number of folks I'm seeing in the room that are working on this issue, including my friends Gabe and Jeanette Salguero, who have really led this conversation in Washington in a lot of ways through the National Latino Evangelical Coalition. And certainly this next speaker has been one of our country's leader on this issue as well, and that's the issue of immigration and how the challenges impacting immigrants in this country are certainly issues of freedom as well. Ginny Yang is the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief. In this position, Ginny works with members of Congress, their staff, and the administration to improve refugee and immigration policy. She previously worked in the resettlement section of World Relief as Senior Case Manager in the East Asia Program Officer, where she focused on advocacy for refugees in the East Asia region and managed the entire refugee caseload for World Relief before their arrival to the United States. Previous to World Relief, she worked at the largest political fundraising firm in Maryland, managing fundraising and campaigning for local politicians. Ginny has researched refugee and asylum law in Madrid, Spain, through the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. She's the co-author of Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. Let's welcome up Ginny.
It's really a great pleasure for me to be here today. I really want to start off my talk by sharing the story of an individual, and his name is Antonio Martinez. He was someone at the young age of 21 years old, had been given a promise in Mexico, where he was born and raised, that he would eventually get a well-paying job in the beautiful state of California. And he was promised this lucrative, well-paying job in the construction industry by someone that he knew from his neighborhood. Now, he went on this promise and eventually came to the United States, but instead of ending up in California, he ended up in the tomato fields of Florida. And eventually what happened is that as he sat there standing in the fields, he thought he was in California, and he saw the person who had promised him this job pay $500 to a local grower, and literally he felt like he was shackled and enslaved in that instant, in that single transaction. And it was several years before he was able to share his story and actually go to law enforcement officials and actually share about how he was detained to a trailer and actually underpaid and unable to contact any of his family members. Now, what's interesting about the story of Antonio Martinez is that he is one of thousands of individuals across this country who are victims of trafficking in the United States because they are migrants, actually. The state of Florida is considered the state that produces 90% of our country's winter tomatoes. And in the past decade, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has found that there's been over 1,200 individuals who are migrant workers who have been exploited for their labor, underpaid, abused, and in certain cases, there have actually been vigilante security guards to make sure that they don't actually run away. Now, what's interesting about the issue of trafficking is that we often think about trafficking as something that impacts countries, all across the world, whether it's Southeast Asia or whether it's Latin America. But oftentimes, I think, especially for the church in the United States, we oftentimes don't see that trafficking is happening right here in our own backyards. In fact, the Department of Justice actually estimates that there are 7,500 individuals that are trafficked across our borders every single year. Now, what's interesting about what makes migrants particularly vulnerable is the fact that there is a complicating network of factors that make these individuals very vulnerable to traffickers. And many of these characteristics have to do with the fact that they are here without a community, without family, oftentimes lured with a promise that they're going to be given the opportunities, and those opportunities and promises don't actually bear out into reality. In the case of Antonio Martinez, this person who was promised a job in California, who was actually forced to pick tomatoes in the fields of Florida, he was 21 years old, he was very young. He came from Mexico, and when he immigrated here, he actually didn't know the language, English, very well. He was here illegally, so he did not have any documentation, which meant that he had a significant fear of actually going to the authorities to actually share his story with them. In fact, he was so fearful of going to the authorities that he lived in this situation for many, many years, and he felt like by sharing his story that he was going to be deported out of our country, not pay the wages that he felt like he deserved, and it led to him continuing to be in the situation of psychological fear, but also physical fear as well. Now, what we see across the United States and in this country is that the Department of Justice actually estimates that the overwhelming majority of victims of trafficking in the United States who are victims of labor trafficking are actually migrants. There are people who were not born in this country and were actually born in another country. Now, it's less of a majority for victims of trafficking who are actually victims of sexual trafficking. But of those who are foreign-born who are victims of sexual trafficking, about 80% of them are here without documentation. Now, what's fascinating about this mix of labor trafficking, sexual trafficking, and especially about the migrants who make their way into the United States is that all of them have these shared stories. In fact, I work in an organization called World Relief where we serve victims of trafficking, immigrants, and refugees at 26 offices around the United States. And there is a real vulnerability and a fear that many of these migrants have because they fear the law, because they don't feel like they have a community that wants to hear their stories, and because they fundamentally don't feel like anyone actually cares about them in the end. Now, the reason I point out to the trafficking in the United States, I also want to point out that this is happening within the global context of trafficking worldwide. Now, as was stated earlier, it is really, really difficult to get an estimate on exactly how many numbers of victims of trafficking there are worldwide, but it's estimated, and a lot of organizations are using the figure of 27 million individuals who are currently captured in the trafficking industry. Now, when we look at the transatlantic slave trade of the 16, 17, and 1800s, there are around 15 million people who were caught up in the slave trade at that time, which means that currently the modern day's form of slavery is almost double that amount. It's probably higher than 27 million, but that's a figure that we commonly use to talk about the sheer numbers of individuals who are impacted by this. Now, what's also interesting is that back in the 1800s, someone could actually buy somebody to actually work in their fields for the amount of $50,000, which was the total of 3 years' wages. But we hear stories all the time of individuals in the United States who are actually trafficked for a mere debt of about $100. And in certain countries around the world, families can be indebted for generations for the mere amount of just $18. Now, this has created one of the worst criminal trafficking industries in the entire world, and right here in the United States as well, where individuals are reduced to commodities and where we hear the stories of their vulnerabilities every single day. And this map just goes to show you the complexity of how we see trafficking in the United States. This map actually shows the routes of trafficking of slavery actually in the 1800s, where most of the slaves that came to the United States and to Europe and to South America were taken from the western coast of Africa. Now, what you see in this next map is that the destination or the origination of victims of trafficking today are from a multitude of locations. They can come from right here in the United States, they can come from Asia, they can come from Eastern Europe, they can come from South America. And it goes to show that the complexity of trafficking in the United States, it can't be confined to one ideal or stereotype of who we think a victim of trafficking is. It has to be taken within the larger context. But I do think right here in the United States that our lack of a functioning immigration system has led to the proliferation of trafficking. In fact, when we have 11 million people in our country today who are here without documentation, many of these individuals are very vulnerable to the exploits and the promises of traffickers who use the fact that they're here without documentation to traffic them into really serious conditions. In fact, a broken immigration system has caused broken people, and I think a broken immigration has actually become a trafficker's best friend in our country. Now, what's interesting, I think, about this conversation, especially when I go and talk to a lot of churches about what's happening in our country, is that people tend to ask me, well, what can I do as a Christian and as a church? And I believe that there's several fundamental responses. The first is, I believe that the church can serve to be the center of hope and restoration and reconciliation in our communities, but it requires that we do so acknowledging that trafficking is happening right here in our own communities. The slavery that happened in the 50s and 60s, or in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, we can feel the residual effects today. I actually live in Baltimore City, where the marginalization of whole communities of color in my city has actually led to people feeling real hopelessness because they don't feel like they have access to education or employment. And I think in immigrant communities, you're feeling the same effects today. Secondly, I think oftentimes we have systems and structures in place that lead to the proliferation of individuals who, for the mere desire to make a profit, are in situations where they're trafficking individuals. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that we're all called to be the Good Samaritan, but at a certain point, if we go down the Jericho Road and we see another person beat up on the side of the road and another person beat up on the side of the road, we have to ask the question, what is wrong with the Jericho Road? I believe in our country today that what's wrong with the Jericho Road is issues of racial reconciliation, is issues of racial injustice, but are issues of immigration as well. And we cannot talk about the issue of trafficking without talking about civil rights. And we cannot talk about civil rights without talking about immigrant rights. They're all tied together. And it's when the church speaks up, not just in service and in being a place of reconciliation and restoration, but speaking up to create structures and systems and laws in place to protect victims of trafficking, especially those who are immigrants, is when I believe we'll see a breaking of the chains of injustice and a restoration of our communities. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you. A broken immigration system is a trafficker's best friend. That'll preach right there. Thank you so much, Jenny, and thank you for giving us some next steps to think about as well.